the opening of the Supreme Court's new term, which begins today. While several justices, including Supreme Court Justice John Roberts, have been known to attend in the past, none were apparently in attendance yesterday, presumably because of security. A New Jersey man is facing charges after being found outside the cathedral with some suspicious items. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has a few controversial cases ahead of them in this new term. On the docket are cases involving so-called conversion therapy for minors, as well as state laws prohibiting athletes identifying as transgender from competing in girls' sports. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Welcome to another edition of EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. We ask the question every day on this program, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? We would love to discuss that with you. If you'd like to give us your answer to that question, pick up the phone and give us a call. The number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, we've got a number for you. That number is 1-205-271-2985. And we'll even put you straight to the front of the line at 1-205-271-2985. You can always send us an email. The email address is open. Check that. The email address is called to communion, CTC at EWTN.com. That's CTC at EWTN.com. And, you can take the boy out of open line, Dr. David Anders, but you can't take open line out of the boy, apparently, as they say. Pedro Quiles is producing the program, and Matt Kabinski screening your telephone calls. We've got an email here to start things off from Byron, and he said, my Protestant family talks about the mark of the beast. What is the Catholic view of this in Revelation?
Yeah, thanks. So one thing that I'm always at pains to emphasize on this show is that the Catholic Church does not have an official interpretation of every passage of the Bible. And in fact, it's very rare that you have anything in the tradition or for the magisterium that says emphatically, this text of Scripture must be read in this one way only. And in fact, Catholics have offered lots of different interpretations of the book of Revelation. The thing that the Catholic Church does, it says, however you interpret Scripture or whatever spin you put on the Christian life, it has to fall within these parameters. Right? It lays out dogmas that govern how we approach Scripture, but beyond that, there's some creative freedom and interpretive liberty that's allowed to individual Catholic exegetes. And so you'll find Catholics who give all kinds of different interpretations to passages within the book of Revelation. There's not one normative view. Although, in my own personal preference here is one that I think is I've learned from modern biblical scholarship, and that is that essentially the book of Revelation is about events that were contemporary with the sacred writer. So unlike Protestant dispensationalists, I don't believe the book of Revelation, the author intended to predict events that would take place in the far future, like in, say, the year 2025 or anything like that. I think he's really thinking about events in his own life. And the beast of Revelation, who is identified with a particular number, we've all heard the 666. There's really good textual evidence for believing that is a reference to Nero Caesar and his persecution of the church. And so I think that's the context of the book of Revelation. Now the question then arises, well, then what relevance is that to me if Nero Caesar's been dead and gone for 2,000 years? And the application in our lives is that there are Antichrist-type people. There are folks like Nero Caesar. There are the perennial reemergence of tyrannical religious and political power that persecutes the people of God is a pervasive aspect of Christian experience. So we can take inspiration from apocalyptic texts from the first century and say the experience of the church in the first century is like the experience of the church today. And in so many places in the world, persecution against Christians is far worse than it was in pagan Rome, and quite horrific. And I don't need to name those regimes. You know which ones they are, but there are places in the world today where you can lose your life, and worse, for naming the name of Christ.
Marcus writes in, how does it work to receive Jesus within you in the Eucharist? What about the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, thank you. So Scripture and the Church differentiate multiple modes of the presence of God. And, we don't limit ourselves to one. And so, for example, Jesus in John chapter 14 says, if you love me and keep my commandments, my Father and I will come to you, and we'll make our dwelling within you. That's a pretty amazing promise of a kind of divine presence, the indwelling of Christ within us. What does that mean? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas defines it this way. He says, Christ indwells us as the known is in the knower, and the beloved is in the lover. And if you are married, and you have gotten to know your wife, and you love her, or your husband, you love him, you know what this means. You know what it feels like when you begin to feel as though you had a second self, when your spouse's interests become your interests, when their concerns become your concerns, when you care for them as you do your own body, and you extend yourself and your interest, to another human being, such that you identify with them in a very intimate way. That's the kind of union that the believer can have with Christ if he loves him and keeps his commandments. And if you lack that kind of union, then you're not going to heaven. And that's essential. That indwelling of the Spirit, which is the fruit of sanctifying grace in your life, is really necessary for salvation. The Eucharist is another kind of presence of Christ. Now, unlike the indwelling, it's possible to have the real presence of Christ and go to hell. You can approach the Eucharist in the state of mortal sin and go to hell. That's possible. Don't advise it, by the way. And St. Paul gives instructions in his first letter to the Corinthians about how not to do that. Like, what's the proper way to approach the Eucharist? Given the dignity of the one that dwells therein, namely Jesus Christ himself, substantially body, blood, soul, and divinity, one ought to approach the Eucharist with true reverence. And I'm not just talking about your bodily posture. I'm talking about your interior state, your love of God, your love of neighbor, your humility, your repentance, your contrition for sin, your amendment of life, your pursuit of the virtues. All these things should be evoked, elicited by your knowledge of the dignity of the one that you're about to receive. And so the Eucharist then serves the end of facilitating the interior union of Christ and the soul. So the two are complementary to one another. They're not in any way antagonistic.
833-288-EWTN, that's our toll-free number. It's an absolutely free telephone call anywhere in North America. 833-288-3986. Daniel writes in the Old Testament, there seemed to be a lot of polygamy. Were wives seen in a different light back then?
Yep, they were. Absolutely. No doubt about it. So there's definitely an evolution across the history of the people of God in their understanding and appreciation for human dignity, and especially the dignity of women. And in the Old Testament, in a lot of the legislation, it seems quite evident to me on reading it that women were basically treated as property. And some of the ramifications of that are quite severe and quite horrific. Jesus does not treat women as property. And by the time you get to Christ, his view of the dignity of women and their role in Christian society and in society at large is completely reversed from that of the Old Testament.
It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, this is Brother John Bosco Mills. In our world, there are so many words and so many images, and they all have different messages, and they're giving us different messages. We need Catholic radio because we need to hear the voice of truth. And the voice of truth is the one that tells us about Jesus and his church. And Catholic radio gives us that truth.
The world needs EWTN Catholic Radio, now more than ever.
I would like to get into your hearts before the great day comes. The beauty of Christmas.
Prepare your heart for the child who is coming with Advent and Christmas with Mother Angelica. Drawn from episodes of her popular television show, these pages are filled with Mother's advice to help you set the child Jesus at the center of your holiday celebrations. From how to cultivate the expectant faith of Our Lady during Advent to coping with suffering and loneliness during the holidays, Mother offers prayerful reflections to help you discover the lasting peace and happiness found in an authentic encounter with the infant Jesus. Advent and Christmas with Mother Angelica, this month's EWTN RC Book Club selection, now available at EWTNRC.com, or call our U.S.-based call center at 205-271-2990.
(833-288-EWTN). That's our toll-free number, 833-288-3986, with your question for Dr. David Anders, or if you would like to answer our question, what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic? David, there are certain ramifications of incarnation Jesus would have experienced that maybe we don't ponder a lot, but he had grandparents. And you can grow in devotion to our Lord's grandmother with the St. Anne Novena free ebook, which guides you through 9 days of prayers to the woman who bore the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's available now at EWTN.com/Nativity of Mary. Again, 833-288-3986 is our toll-free number. First up today is Thomas in Fargo, North Dakota, listening on Real Presence Radio. Thomas, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, Dr. Anders. I have a question for you. I'm Catholic and my wife is Protestant, and I have struggled with sins of lust, and I've been working through those issues through the confessional, and my wife has a hard time reconciling this, and she desires for me to, instead of going to the confessional, bring these sins to her and confess them to her instead. And I have a hard time knowing how to handle those desires of hers, and we're going to be getting some counseling to help us work through some of these issues. It's Christian counseling through a Protestant ministry, and I just thought that you might have some advice on this, how I can maybe navigate this, and maybe you're a former Protestant and you understand how.
Oh yeah. So, I really appreciate it, and I understand the dilemma that you facing, and it's multifaceted here. So I have a couple observations to make. And the Protestantism comes into play, and this is important to understand, because Protestantism has a different theology of sin and a different theology of sex than the Catholic Church does. Both of these things may be problematic in your present case. So first of all, something that Christians don't adequately appreciate, modern American Christians, Catholic or Protestant, is that unlike the Protestant Church, the Catholic Church distinguishes concupiscence from actual sin. And concupiscence is the result of the fall, and it is our very normal human inclination to be immoderately attached to bodily pleasures, including the pleasures of sex. Having an immoderate desire for sexual pleasure is not itself sinful. It is, in fact, a manifestation of concupiscence. Sin comes in only when there's rational reflection, only when there's a choice of the will to choose an object that's inappropriate or an appropriate object in an inappropriate way. That's the only time that sin comes in. And so if you are, like most men, at particularly of a certain age, you may have a highly activated sexual drive, and you may feel deeply conflicted about that. That in itself is not sinful. It's very normal. What becomes sinful is when you direct that sexual appetite into inappropriate channels. And again, to find an objectively beautiful woman attractive is not itself objectively sinful, right? To direct your sexual appetite towards someone that's not your wife, whether in fantasy or in reality, now that is sinful, okay? And so there are shades of difference here, and I want you to be aware of them, because I don't want you to feel guilty and feel like you have to flagellate yourself or go endlessly to confession just because you happen to have, normal sexual responses. That in itself is not a sinful thing. although Protestantism tends to treat it as though it is sinful. Luther specifically said concupiscence is sin, and so you can sin without willing to. Catholic Church says you can only sin if you will to sin. So let's be sure that what you're confessing are actual sins and not just sort of normal bodily processes. Secondly, when you talk to a Protestant counselor about marital problems, particularly as they pertain to sexual life, Protestant Church generally has a different theology of marital sex than the Catholic Church does. So for one thing, I mean, this is the most obvious difference. Protestants in general tend to approve of contraceptive, sterile sex, as well as other forms of sexual activity that the Catholic Church would rule out. And Catholics believe that it is possible for a man, or a woman too for that matter, to sexually objectify their spouse and to treat them in a way that lacks dignity and that is therefore morally problematic. And that's a distinction that's rarely made in Protestant circles. And in fact, it kind of depends on who you talk to, but there are quite a few Protestant authorities that basically teach that within the bounds of matrimony, anything goes, even if one spouse finds the behavior demeaning. And so that can lead to really bad advice about how to handle sexual problems in marriage if it's coming from a Protestant pastor who has a really deficient doctrine of marital sexuality. Sometimes it's combined, and this is particularly true on the evangelical right, with a particular kind of patriarchy that is sort of doubly demeaning to the wife and her dignity and freedom, and can put a really, really horrible burden on her I'm not going to go into the details, but you follow where I'm going with this. So you need to be cautious about asking for marital and sex advice from someone that doesn't share the Catholic doctrine on marriage and sexuality. And you need to be cautious about going to confession if you're in fact being informed by a kind of Lutheran concept of guilt rather than a Catholic understanding of moral responsibility. Now, when it comes to confessing your sins to your wife, you are, of course, under no moral obligation to do any such thing. The Church teaches that we have to confess our known mortal sins, all right, not all our venial sins, but our mortal sins to a priest at least once a year. That's the obligation to confess our sins. We make a general confession of sin every time we go to Mass in the Confiteor, and implicitly every time we say the Lord's Prayer. Right, so there's an acknowledgement of our sinfulness. It's part of Christian life, but sacramental confession, we auricular confession, where we name our faults by kind and number, we do that to a priest. That's the only requirement. I think, personally, as someone who's been married for well over 30 years and as a Catholic for well over 20, I think it's very imprudent to burden your wife with all that information. I think it's a bad idea. And particularly if it pertains to the sexual sphere, no two people are exactly alike. Every woman is different. But I think the danger that you face is that because men and women typically have very different patterns of sexual response, women might be inordinately threatened if you have how can I put this delicately? If you have an overactive sense of your own personal guilt, maybe even scrupulous kind of concern about your own sexuality, and you articulate that to your wife habitually and frequently, couching it or categorizing it as sinful behavior, you're going to create the expectation or the anxiety in her that you have like a strong desire for infidelity. And I'm presuming that's not the case, right? That your desire is to be faithful to your wife and faithful to your vows, and you're just trying to do the arduous work of being a husband, which means learning to control your sexual appetites and exercising continence and chastity, right? This is a struggle for everybody. That's a good thing, like to fight the good fight, to strive after virtue and to fight for it, manfully with fortitude is a good thing. That in itself is not sinful. But if you present it under under the description of, I have this weakness and I'm sinful and I have to go to confession all the time, it may create this anxiety in your wife that you are in fact tempted to sins of infidelity, and then she may begin to feel bad about herself, and maybe she has to compete or keep up or whatnot. And it's a dynamic that I don't think is healthy necessarily to bring into your marriage. And particularly if she's pressuring you about it, that makes me think that, maybe she is fearful of this thing. And so my advice as a married person is that what you communicate to her constantly is your fidelity, your love, your tenderness, your commitment to her, her attractiveness to you, your deep, passionate desire to be one man and one woman, and she's for you and you're for her, and there's nobody else in the world, and constantly to build her up and to support her and affirm her, and keep those things that are likely to hurt her to yourself. And if you need to, bring them up in the confessional. That would be my counsel to you as a Catholic husband.
God bless you, Thomas. You'll have a lot of people praying for you in your situation. Thank you so much for the phone call today. That opens up a line for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. David, there are little things that every once in a while it's just a good idea to double back, and we have to repeat these things. Our audience is rotating on a constant basis, and it's just a good thing to reinforce every once in a while so people understand where we're coming from. And I do this on the heels of you and I having a disagreement last week about some semantics, which is actually funny. It just occurred to me right now. But there are certain things, for sure, especially in America, that can be spoken about in the Protestant world with a pretty broad brush with regard to teachings and how things are believed.
Yep.
But when you refer to the Protestant Church, you're in no way speaking individually for every Protestant and their beliefs that might be listening.
Thank you very much for that qualification, because invariably when I generalize about Protestants, I will get angry phone calls and letters from people saying I'm Protestant and I don't believe that sort of thing. So yeah, let me specify. When I did make some general statements there. There is, for example, I'm not going to name the name, but there's a very well-respected Protestant media ministry, particularly associated with psychology and personal counseling and advice, and it's like very well known, and people in the evangelical church, especially in the 90s, got really in the habit of kind of looking up what this media ministry would say was okay to do in marriage. How do you raise your kids? How do you get married? How do you treat your spouse in the bedroom? That sort of thing. And it kind of began to function in a subset of the evangelical world as almost like a Protestant magisterium. You want advice on marriage, family, and sex, you go to that outfit, they'll tell you what to do, and then if you quoted their authorities, it almost carried the weight of almost magisterial authority in those circles. However, if you were Episcopalian, you were a Methodist, you went to the Presbyterian Church USA, more mainline Protestant denomination, or even something much more fundamentalist to the right, you probably didn't do that at all, right? And so, but that's really what I had in mind. I was sort of thinking of that subset of evangelicalism that takes that particular attitude towards marriage and sexuality.
Yeah. Chris is up next in Western New York, watching us today on YouTube. Chris, thanks for holding. You're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, Dr. Anders. I'm Catholic, and I know that there's a lot of talk about ecumenism in the church today. So I was reading through the second letter of John, and I came to verses 9 through 11, and I could read those here. It says, "Anyone who goes ahead and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into the house or give him any greeting, for he who greets him shares his wicked work." So I guess my question is it okay for Catholics to befriend non-Catholics?
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So the context of 2 John is completely different from the concern that you're raising. In the Johannine epistles, a major issue is schism within the church. So you have a bishop with legitimate apostolic authority and a party that has rejected him, and they've set up an anti-bishop who is literally kicking people out of fellowship if they fellowship with the legitimate bishop. So you have a church split here. And the context is really whether you should welcome people into the context of Christian ministry in the church if they are not authorized by the Apostolic Church. And so this is a problem we have in contemporary Catholicism, right? That if any priest who wants to minister in a diocese other than the one where he is incarnated he has to carry letters with him from the bishop of his incardination. He has to send his credentials ahead. Like if I have a priest friend in Alabama who was going to go to a conference in a neighboring state quite recently, and he had to get his papers sent. He had to get authorized to go from one diocese to another, just to go to a conference, because at that conference he'll probably concelebrate Mass. He's not even going to hear confessions or preach, but he'll concelebrate Mass. In order to say Mass in that other diocese, he's got to prove that he's a priest in good standing in this diocese. And it makes good sense that you have this kind of rule within the Catholic Church, because every once in a while you'll get some rogue priest who maybe he's been excommunicated by his bishop, he's been laicized by the Vatican, but he runs around wearing a clerical collar, which is against the law, and he's not allowed to do that, but he does it anyway. And he holds himself out to be, Father so-and-so, and starts giving seminars and teaching classes, and God forbid, celebrating the sacraments. And an unwary lay Catholic faithful maybe get sucked into his little personality cult, and then they find out later he's not even a priest with valid faculties, right? And he may be teaching all kinds of nonsense and leading them astray. That's really much more the context here that we're looking at. We're not talking about, should you be friends with sinners? That's obvious. Jesus says, go be friends with sinners, right? I mean, that's what Christ did in his own ministry. He eschewed the religious establishment of his day with their hypocrisy and their rules and their self-righteousness. And he ate with prostitutes and tax collectors and lepers and others that were outcasts from society. So that's it's completely different context.
833-288 EWTN's our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Straight ahead, we'll talk to Carol in North Carolina, Catherine on Long Island in New York, Brian in Peoria, and we've got plenty of time for your calls as well. 833-288-3986. It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Here's today's quote from Mother Angelica's perpetual calendar. We are going to have crosses, so we need the grace to see God's hand in them, the grace to understand the economy of God. Mother's spiral-bound perpetual calendar features an inspirational message for each day of the year. It's available from the EWTN Religious Catalog at EWTNRC.com, or you can call 1-800-854-6316.
EWTN is looking for qualified people to fill a number of exciting positions. Make a difference using your God-given talent. Visit EWTN.com/employment today.
Hi, I'm Doug Keck. This is an EWTN Bookmark Brief. Speaking with Father Michael Lang about his book, A Short History of the Roman Mass, which was published by Ignatius Press. And of course, it's available through our EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. So tell me, Father Michael, why a short history of the Roman Mass? Why is it important for Catholics to understand this?
The liturgy of the Mass has developed and grown over the centuries. Mm-hmm. And I'm convinced that it is actually helpful to enter into the spirit of the liturgy, to understand its prayers, to know something about its history.
Okay, very good. The author is Father Michael Lang, the book, A Short History of the Roman Mass, and again, available through our catalog. I'm Doug Keck. This has been a Bookmark Brief. Thanks for stopping by. We shall see you next time. Thanks.
On tomorrow's Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, our topic will be fasting from social media. And now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Right back to the phones we go on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Next up is Carol. She is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, listening on Divine Mercy Radio. Carol, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, Dr. Anders. I've been so upset for a long time, and I'm so glad to talk to you. I heard you say something maybe 6 to 8 months ago on the radio, and I've just been really upset about it. And I wanted to talk to my priest, but he's so liberal. I knew what he'd say. He'd say, "Oh, that's okay." But In the beginning, my husband and I married young, and we became Catholic. We were Protestants, and we're converts. We became Catholics. Probably we were about 20 years old. And back then, there wasn't really much teaching. We just, since we'd been baptized, our priest then just thought we were great and just went ahead and proclaimed we were Catholics and confirmed us. So through the years, we've been trying to learn pretty much on our own and through Bible study and so forth what the Catholic teaching is. So, and we had one child, and she was born on our first anniversary, actually. And so we raised her in the Catholic faith, and she went to a Catholic girls' school. And so right before she was 18 years old, she was killed in a car wreck. And we're thankful she didn't suffer. She was killed instantly. But anyway, before about 3 months before the wreck, there was a study during Lent at her school on death and dying and so forth. And so the girls had to do some thinking about death and dying. So she told me that when she died, she wanted to have her ashes scattered over the Smoky Mountains because that's where we camped and hiked and so forth. There's the three of us so many times. And I said, "Oh, no, honey." I said, "We've got our plots over at the cemetery with our family." She said, "No, I really, really want this." So when she was killed, I knew right what to do. I told the undertaker that she was to be cremated and her ashes we were going to scatter her ashes, and I did. I went up in a plane and I scattered her ashes over the Smoky Mountains. And back then, this was 40 years ago. Back then, it was kind of rare, even cremation. She was the first cremation, I think, from our church ever, and our priest wasn't happy about that. But anyway, so I heard you say on your program months ago that, if somebody just wants to be cremated and their ashes scattered in the mountains with the bears and the flowers, that's not okay. And I couldn't believe, because that's exactly what I did, and now I don't know what to do. What's going to happen to her?
I can put you at ease, Carol. I can put your mind at ease. I can take care of you. Thank you so much for calling. I'm so glad I could talk to you, and I'm so sorry that you have been suffering these months in anxiety about this. You do not need to have any anxiety about this whatsoever at all, for several reasons. First of all, when you are ignorant through no fault of your own of the moral obligation, then you have no moral responsibility. It's what the church calls invincible ignorance. And you did not know, and you didn't know that you didn't know that this was against canon law. And so you wouldn't have known to disabuse yourself. I mean, it didn't even strike you that you should seek out alternate opinions. You acted in complete ignorance and in good faith, trying to do something good. And even though, it was irregular from a canonical point of view, but you acted in ignorance. And your ignorance, as far as I can judge, was invincible. It wasn't your fault. And the church says that you have no moral responsibility when you're invincibly ignorant. So you did not do anything subjectively wrong. Objectively, it was against the church's law. Subjectively, nothing wrong at all. And so you can put your mind completely at ease in terms of your own moral responsibility. With respect to your daughter's eternal state, this has no bearing on that question whatsoever at all. The mode of Christian burial does not affect the ultimate destiny of the soul. The reason the church has burial rites is that we want the living to understand the dignity of the body, the dignity of the person, to pray for the repose of the soul, these sorts of things. But the disposition of the body doesn't have anything to do with the ultimate fate of the soul. I mean, our prayers for the soul can be of benefit to the souls in purgatory. But barring that, with that one exception, there's just the final judgment. The particular judgment happens at the moment of death. It does not depend on the mode of burial. Right? The church still has laws about burial because, as I mentioned, it's important to communicate to people through the church's rites what the values and priorities are. And we do believe the body is a member of Christ and has its own dignity. It will be raised again on the last day. And for these reasons, Christian burial is the appropriate way to handle the remains of the deceased, or cremation if the remains be kept in a consecrated location like a columbarium or a Catholic cemetery. But in this case, your daughter's fate is not in any way altered by this mishap on your part, nor do you bear any moral responsibility. So, put your mind at ease about that.
Does that help, Carol?
I can't tell you how much I appreciate you telling me that. I've been so tormented since I heard you.
I am so sorry.
So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And God bless you and all
God
you
bless
do
you.
and all the people you help. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Next up is Catherine, a first-time caller on Long Island in New York, watching us on EWTN television today. Catherine, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Yes, hi. Well, I have one question, and I just would like to know why at the Mass the Hail Mary is not said at the Mass.
Yeah.
Of course, they say the Hail Father,
Yeah.
but they never say the Hail Mary.
Yes.
And even as a youngster, I don't remember. I went to Catholic high school and grammar school, and I don't remember whether or not they ever did it at the Masses at that time. I was young.
Yes.
And I'm just curious. I even mentioned it to the priest, a few of them, and I never got an answer.
I can give you an
I'm
answer.
so curious to know.
I can give you an
Yes.
answer. Absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So the Mass is the form of worship that was prescribed by Jesus. He gave us the elements of the Mass specifically with the command to do this in memory of me. And so it is the only form of Christian worship, public worship, that was actually mandated directly by Christ. And so the rubrics of the Mass, that is to say the instructions for how you do it, flow directly out of the institution by Christ, and then its embellishments, that have occurred through Catholic tradition. But they're essentially embellishments of that central rite given to us by Jesus. Now, I should say that the Blessed Virgin Mary is invoked in the Mass. She is absolutely invoked in the Mass more than once. We ask for her prayers and intercessions. And of course, in the Byzantine liturgy, the liturgy of the Greek Church, there are many references and prayers to the Theotokos, the Mother of God, Blessed Virgin Mary, under that particular description. And so it's not like she's ignored in the Mass. She's not. She's there, right? And of course, she's there worshiping with us. But the Hail Mary as a devotional form, like the actual prayers of the Hail Mary, do not date from the apostolic period. The Hail Mary that we have today dates basically from the 12th or 13th century, and later. And so it's a later devotional edition. It's not a universal in Catholic practice. There are Catholics. There are Catholic rites throughout the world in which the Hail Mary is not traditional. It is very traditional in the Latin rites, not traditional in other rites. And again, it was a private devotion that developed specifically as an alternative to the Church's liturgy. So if the Mass, the liturgy of the Church, the worship given to us by Christ, is the particular provenance of the priests, and in the Catholic Middle Ages, it was also, the Benedictines would say the Mass, the Benedictine monks would say the Mass in the divine hours, the liturgy of the hours, on a regular basis. And there was a desire felt by many of the lay people to have sort of their own private devotion when they couldn't make it to Mass, when they weren't able to assist at the liturgy of the hours at the Benedictine monastery. They wanted to have something outside the monastery, outside the Mass they could pray in their own lives. And the 150 Aves of the three mysteries of the Rosary were designed as a specific alternative to the 150 Psalms of the Psalter that were prayed in the divine office. And so it was intended from the beginning as a private devotion outside the context of the liturgy.
God bless you, Catherine. Thanks so much for the phone call today. 833-288-EWTN. Probably squeeze in a couple more calls at 833-288-3986. Brian's in Peoria, Illinois, listening on Covenant Radio today. Brian, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, Dr. Anders.
Hi.
I come to you with a question because I committed a very serious moral sin and made confession for that, related to a very long-standing addiction and problem that I had in my life.
Okay.
And then went and immediately confessed it.
That's the
However,
thing to do.
I've been having tremendous amounts of pain and suffering related
so
to
sorry.
it. And I know that I was given absolution by the power of Jesus.
Okay.
However, is there anything that I should be concerned about at this point, despite having been given absolution?
Okay, yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. So absolution absolves you of the guilt of sin, and the penance you perform addresses the temporal punishment due to sin. But the confession itself does not eliminate the habit pattern from your life. And so when you say, is there anything I should be concerned about? Yeah, we should be concerned about the habit pattern of your life. And the sacraments are effective in our lives, but they're only effective if we cooperate with grace. We can't presume the sacraments are going to work in us if we don't bring forth all of the appropriate effort on our part. And the appropriate effort on our part is to construct a rule of life, a pattern of life, that facilitates the practice of virtue. So, if you think about something like the institution of monasticism, and no, I'm not advising that you join a monastery, but I'm just using it as an illustration. If you consider something like the institution of monasticism, why does it exist? Well, monasticism exists because there are certain people who wish to construct a form of life that deeply facilitates the practice of virtue. They want to be able to live in community and practice brotherly charity and take, vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and have the support of the community to live that. The structure of their lives around prayer and work. These kinds of things are habits of life that are meant to facilitate the pursuit of virtue and the avoidance of vice. Well, you're not going to join a monastery, I trust, but you can still derive a rule of life that will, for example, include systems for how to handle temptation when it emerges. So what do I mean by a system? If you read the psychological literature on habits, what the psychologists will tell you is that habits work like this. You have a trigger, you have a response, and then there's a kind of reward. And those things get lodged neurologically in your brain, and you can never get rid of them. Right? That's why, the alcoholic who's been dry for 20 years takes one drink and then boom, he's right back to where he was at his last bender, right? It's like he didn't have 20 years sober. He's just straight back to where he was before, because you lay down those neural pathways and they don't ever go away. So what you do instead is you don't get rid of the old habits. You lay down new habits. And so let's say you have a trigger for this destructive behavior. Maybe the trigger is loneliness. All right, so you have this experience of loneliness, and unthinkingly, the urge is go to the thing that I always do when I get lonely, and that sets you off on that bad path. Right? What you have to do is you have to consciously insert a new routine, and I'm not going to tell you what that is because you have to figure that out. Maybe you can do it with a counselor. Maybe you can do it with a spiritual director. This is not even a suggestion, it's just an illustration. So you might say, okay, when I get lonely, I'm going to pray the rosary. All right? St. Jerome had a habit pattern that he put into place. I heard this one from Mitch Pacwa. When Jerome would struggle with thoughts of impurity, he'd study Hebrew. And he became the best darn Hebraist in the history of the Christian tradition. He studied a lot of Hebrew. Some guy might go to the gym. He might run a 5K. I mean, there's 1,000 things you could do. You put in a new habit pattern, and you construct your whole life with systems that are designed to facilitate the practice of virtue, and to avoid vice. And you don't do it alone, right? You set up patterns of accountability to a confessor, to a spiritual director, to a 12-step group. You might think about, you look into Catholics in Recovery, you look into Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous. You get some recovery community around you of people that can support you. You get into counseling. You're very proactive in your life in rooting out the occasions of sin. When we go to confession, we say, one of the things you promise in confession is to avoid sin and everything that leads me to sin, all the occasions of sin. Well, that's a big deal. Like actually thinking through in my life, what are the occasions of sin? Start journaling about it, writing it down, reflecting it. Okay, if you stumble and fall, does it help to beat yourself up and tell yourself what a worthless piece of junk you are? No, that's really not very helpful at all. That ends up just facilitating and exacerbating this problem of self-hatred that may end up to yet more stumbles in the future. What you do instead is productively step back and go, okay, what happened? What were the occasions? What time of day was it? Where was I? Who was I with? What was I thinking? What was my emotional state? Am I eating right? Am I sleeping right? Am I exercising? Look at all those dynamics. Track a mood chart. Like, was I in a good mood? Was I in a bad mood? Was I in a flat mood? And start figuring out what are the patterns of my life that habitually lead to these kinds of stumbles. If once I identify them, start creating new habit patterns, new routines, and new systems to handle those moments in your life in some more productive way. Do it with help. Do it with a community. Do it with accountability. Don't do it with self-hatred. Don't do it with self-loathing. Don't do it with self-flagellation.
I want to tell you about a great program we have Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, More to Life with Dr. Greg and Lisa Popcak. Dr. Greg and Lisa help listeners navigate the waters of family life with solutions straight from the genius of St. John Paul II's theology of the body. That's More to Life with Dr. Greg and Lisa Popcak, weekday mornings, 10 Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. Next up is Lou in St. Louis, Missouri, listening on Covenant Radio. Lou, you are on with Dr. David Anders.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call. First of all, happy 55th birthday to you, Dr. Anders, coming up on Wednesday. I thank God for you. And I want to follow up on something I brought up with you before about women deacons. I took it up with the pastor, a wonderful priest, where they're having they had appreciation of Saint Phoebe, and I cited this interview of Pope Francis by Nora O'Donnell, where he denied the possibility of having women deacons, and also the notes on the passage about Phoebe, the deacon Phoebe, in the New American Bible. It says it's a different kind of diaconate, and he said that he doesn't share my views on those things, even though he's aware of them, and he quoted the section 60 of the final document of the Synod on Synodality that says the question of women's access to the diaconal ministry also remains open. Discernment in this regard must remain open. I'm not all that comfortable with a synod on synodality. It sounds like a meta-synod to me, and I don't know where that synod on synodality came from. So I wondered what you would say about all this.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, let's talk about women deacons, and then let's talk about the synod. Let's start talking about St. Phoebe. So in Romans chapter 16, Paul commends Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in Rome. And he uses the word diakonos to refer to her status as a servant. Diakonos is a word in Greek that just means servant. Now, does it refer to an ecclesiastical office obtained through ordination? That's really the question about Phoebe. And emphatically, it does not and cannot mean that. There's no possible way it can mean that in St. Paul's epistle, because in Paul's earlier undisputed letters, there is absolutely no reference whatsoever at all to such an office. Paul doesn't have a developed ecclesiology with all the church offices that will become apparent, say, in the pastoral epistles, where deacon is a specified office. And if you think that he does, then you would have to assume that the pagan rulers of Rome were deacons in the church. Because in Romans chapter 13, just right before he says, Phoebe as a servant of the church, he says Christians should be subject to all the governing authorities. Well, the governing authorities were definitely not Christian in 60 A.D. They should be subject to all the governing authorities because the one who governs is a diakonos of God. He's a servant of God who bears the sword and executes justice, right? And so it's very evident from these and parallel passages that the word diakonos in this and most other passages of the New Testament just refers to the capacity of serving. Just refers to the capacity of serving, someone who is a servant-hearted individual, someone who helps other people, right? It does not refer to an ordained office. When you begin to find descriptions of the ordained office, say in the pastoral epistles, then there are qualifications that indicate that men are in view. And when it comes to the actual cases in history, there is no precedent whatsoever at all for ordaining women to that position. The ordained ecclesiastical office of the diaconate is the first grade of holy orders that culminated in the episcopacy, which is reserved for men only. So, there's just the biblical argument is not there for female deacons. Not based on some sort of analysis of diakonos and this sort of thing in Greek. I mean, people may come up with other arguments, but the reference to Phoebe is just, I think that's a red herring. Okay, now when it comes to the Synod on synodality, so Pope Francis called for a process throughout the universal church where individual dioceses would create opportunities for listening, and Catholics and non-Catholics would have an opportunity to go and speak to representatives of their diocese about their concerns and experiences in the Catholic Church, and then those dioceses would forward the reports of those conversations to the national conference from their country, and then those were in turn compiled and edited and reduced and then sent on to Rome, and then a final document was produced based on all of that conversation. Now, I know in my own diocese, the process was deeply positive. I know the guys that ran the dialogues in my diocese, and they went out and sort of took soundings in the Catholic community. And there were Catholics in my community who were 70 years old, been Catholic their whole life, who came forward and said, we didn't know about this synod business, but now we see what it's about, and we're really appreciative because this is the first time in my entire Catholic life anybody has ever asked me what I thought. And that just seems like good sense to me, that if the church wants to do a better job ministering to the needs of its people, sometimes every once in a while it's okay to step in and go, hey, how you guys doing? Tell us what's going on in your life so we can do a better job helping you. And that was essentially the idea. As far as the status of the document, I mean, this is not an official pronouncement of the magisterium. It was a process initiated by the magisterium, but I mean, people said all kinds of things. You show up in church and you're a layperson and you say, well, this is what I think. I mean, that's not authoritative. It may be relevant. It may inform pastoral ministry in that, if people have the wrong idea, we need to address that. Maybe people have unmet pastoral needs, we need to address that. But it doesn't bear the weight of some sort of official papal pronouncement at all. And it's also entirely possible, it's not inconsistent with Catholic theology, that the people that were doing the editing themselves may have their own agenda, and it might not be the Pope's agenda, and it might not be the Church's agenda, it might be their own agenda, and that kind of thing can get into church documentation. And I mean, there was a celebrated case in the United States many years ago of a particular English translation of the liturgy that did not reflect the mind of the Church, and so when Pope Benedict became Pope, he said, you know what, we're going to clean up that English translation of the liturgy. Right, so he mandated that you had to do another one because the first one wasn't any good, right? And these kinds of things happen. It's just part of the process of being an organization this large. And so I read these synod documents and I find them interesting, and sometimes I draw material out of them for my talks. But I certainly don't think that what somebody said in some parish in Atlanta, Georgia is just because it shows up in a church document, doesn't bear the weight of a pope behind it by no means.
Thanks so much, Lou. We appreciate the phone call. And really quickly, David, in the last couple of seconds we have left here, Jeff is watching us on YouTube, and he says, is purgatory for unconfessed sins, or is it needed because we need the sanctification process because we chose to sin?
Yeah. I'd like to really go into that at greater length, but here comes the music, So purgatory is when it's not just a question of unconfessed sins, but you can confess a sin and not have done penance, right? And when you talk about doing penance, there's not a kind of mathematical proportionality exactly between the penance that you do and the judgment of Almighty God.
It's paying for the window you already said you were sorry for breaking.
That's right.
On behalf of our host, Dr. David Anders, our producer, Pedro Quiles, our call screener, Matt Gubensky, and social media maven, Rich Jesse, I'm Jack Williams. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. God bless.
Another great podcast on EWTN Podcast Central is Way of the Fathers. It's a podcast about the fathers and doctors